The stagecoach was a ghost, a rattling cage of dust and memories that spat her out into the Wyoming silence and vanished. For Annalise, the world that opened up was so big it hurt to look at. The sky wasn't a roof, it was an ocean, and the land rolled on forever. This was 1879, a place where a person could disappear without a sound. She held her old carpet bag like an anchor. Inside was everything she owned in the world. She'd come out here to start over, to wash the filth of the city off her hands and build a life. Her skill was simple: flour, salt, water. She could make bread that tasted like forgiveness. And right now she needed a little of that herself. The ranch wasn't what she'd pictured. It was a place built for survival, not for comfort. A grim two-story house stared at her with blank windows. A big red barn stood with its mouth gaping open, breathing out the smell of hay and shadows. The air was dust and animal sweat and something wild she couldn't name. It was a world away from the city, and the loneliness hit her like a punch to the gut. She took a breath, said a prayer under her breath, and walked toward the house that looked like it was waiting to swallow her whole. The man who opened the door was named Caleb. He wasn't old, but he wore his years like a heavy coat in the summertime. His face was a roadmap of sun and worry. His hands were leather, tools that had seen a lifetime of hard work. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were hazel, but that wasn't the point. They were windows into a house where all the lights had been turned off. He was polite, but his politeness was a wall 10 feet high. No smile, just a nod. "Miss Annalise," he rumbled. "Stage was on time. That's a first." He didn't invite her in, just stepped back to let her pass. References were good. The job's simple. 3 meals a day. Keep the house. Do the laundry. That's the work. His boots hammered on the floorboards as he gave her the tour. The main room was a kitchen and a living space, all business. A big black stove squatted in the corner like a giant iron spider. A rough table, a few chairs, a fireplace. No pictures, no flowers, nothing soft, just a faded little needlepoint on the wall that said, "Bless this home." It felt like a joke. This was a structure, not a home. He pointed to a small door off the kitchen. "This'll be yours. Has its own door to the outside. Privacy for both of us." The message was crystal clear. "You are the help. Stay separate." And that's when she saw the shadow. It detached itself from Caleb's leg and resolved into a little girl, maybe 5 years old. She had eyes the color of a clear summer sky in a mess of blonde curls. In her arms, she clutched a dirty rag doll with button eyes that seemed to stare right through Annalise. Caleb put a heavy hand on the girl's head, and for just a second, a flicker of something human crossed his face. "This is my daughter, Lily." Annalise knelt down, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Hello, Lily." The little girl was a spark of life in this dead place, but Lily didn't answer. She just stepped forward and touched the fabric of Annalise's dress, a strange, testing gesture, as if to see if she were real. Then she gave a tiny, shy smile and buried her face in her father's pants. Caleb sighed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "She's shy. You'll make her meals. See to her washing. I handle the rest." Just like that, the introduction was over. He tipped his hat. "Fence line to men before sundown. Settle in. Supper's at 6. The door closed behind him, and the silence that rushed in was bigger than the house. It was the silence of a man who had forgotten how to speak, and a little girl who had no one to talk to. Annalise stood there in the quiet, the little girl just watching her. She did the only thing she knew how to do when the world got too loud or too quiet. She worked. She unpacked her few things in the little room, 2 other dresses, a Bible. Then she tied on an apron and marched into the kitchen like it was a battlefield. She found flour and salt and yeast. Soon her hands were white with purpose, kneading dough on the rough wooden table. The familiar rhythm was a prayer. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. As the dough came to life, the smell of it began to fill the empty corners of the house. It was a simple smell, an honest smell, the smell of life. Lily watched from the doorway, her rag doll held tight. She was a little ghost in a calico dress. As the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows and the scent of baking bread grew stronger, the little girl drifted closer. Annalise didn't say a word. She just broke off a small piece of dough and held it out. Lily's blue eyes went wide. She took the dough and sat at the table, her small fingers pushing and shaping it into a little loaf of her own. They worked side by side in a comfortable silence, two strangers brought together by bread. Hours later, Caleb returned. He was covered in the dust and sweat of a long day's work. He stopped dead in the doorway, his hard face unreadable. The table was set. A pot of stew bubbled on the stove, and on a wooden board sat a perfect loaf of golden brown bread, the crust still crackling as it cooled. The house was warm. It smelled like a home. For just a heartbeat, the ice in his eyes seemed to melt. A flicker of surprise, maybe something more. Then it was gone, and the wall was back up. He just nodded, sat down, and ate. The meal was silent. The only sounds were spoons scraping against bowls and the wind starting to whisper outside. The days fell into a pattern. Caleb was a phantom who left at dawn and returned at dusk. Annalise scrubbed and cooked and baked, chasing the shadows out of the house with the smell of good food. And Lily became her own little shadow. The shyness burned away, replaced by a constant stream of chatter. She told Annalise stories about her doll, about the horses, about the shapes she saw in the clouds. Annalise listened and laughed, and a space in her heart she thought was closed forever began to open up for this lonely, motherless child. One afternoon, they were in the vegetable garden out back. Annalise was picking beans, the sun warm on her neck. Lily was sitting in the dirt, making a little circle out of pebbles. In the distance, Caleb was a tiny speck on horseback. Lily looked up, her face suddenly serious. She motioned for Annalise to come closer. Annalise knelt in the dirt, expecting the little girl to show her a shiny rock or a funny-looking bug. Instead, Lily put her small hands on Annalise's cheeks. Her blue eyes were deep and solemn. She leaned in close, her lips almost touching Annalise's ear. Her whisper was as light as air, but it hit Annalise like a bolt of lightning. "I picked you," Lily breathed. "Papa said we needed a cook, but I told him I needed a mama." She pulled back, her eyes searching Annalise's face. "I picked you to be my new mommy." Annalise froze. The sun went cold. The sound of the wind in the grass turned into a roar in her ears. She looked into Lily's hopeful, innocent eyes, and the ground fell out from under her. It all crashed down on her at once. She wasn't here because of her references. She wasn't here because she could bake bread. She was here because a heartbroken little girl had pointed a finger and made a wish. And her father, a man frozen in his own grief, hadn't been able to say no. He hadn't hired a cook. He had bought his daughter a toy. And she was it. The loneliness that swept over her then was colder and darker than any Wyoming night. She was a fraud. She was a hired hand in a child's make-believe game, and she had no idea what to do next. The days after Lily's secret were a special kind of hell. Every smile Annalise gave the little girl felt like a lie. Every loaf of bread she pulled from the oven felt like part of a performance. She was a ghost in this house, haunting the edges of a family she could never truly be a part of. The warmth she had started to feel for this place, for this broken man and his beautiful daughter, now curdled into something sour and shameful. She felt like a fool, a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Caleb noticed the change, of course. The light that had started to creep back into his house was gone. Annalise was quiet, efficient, her eyes always downcast. He told himself it wasn't his problem. She was paid to do a job. Her feelings were her own. But when he came in from the fields, the silence in the house was heavy again. It felt like it had before she came. It felt like a tomb. Lily felt it most of all. "Are you sad?" she'd ask, tugging on Annalise's apron. Annalise would force a smile. "Just tired, sweet girl." The thought of leaving was a constant whisper in her mind. Just pack the carpet bag and wait for the stagecoach. But where would she go? And the image of Lily's confused, hurt face when she found her gone, it was a chain around her ankles. So she stayed. And she prayed for a sign, for a way forward through this mess. The sign came not as a whisper, but as a scream. It started one evening at supper. Lily, usually so full of stories, just pushed her food around her plate. Her cheeks were too red, her eyes too bright. By the time Annalise put her to bed, the little girl's skin was on fire. The fever came on like a prairie fire, fast and ruthless. and Caleb's iron control shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, terrifying gray. The look in his eyes was pure, naked fear. He was seeing another bed, another fever, another ghost. His big, capable hands fumbled with a basin of water, shaking so badly he spilled half of it on the floor. Annalise didn't wait to be asked. Her own hurt and confusion evaporated. This was a child. This was Lily. She gently took the cloth from his trembling fingers. "I'll sit with her," she said, her voice the calmest thing in the room. Caleb could only nod, his throat locked tight with terror. He backed away to the doorway and just stood there, a helpless giant watching everything he had left in the world burn. The night was endless. Annalise sat by the bed, bathing Lily's face, whispering prayers, singing every hymn she knew in a low, soft voice. She was no longer a cook. She was no longer a pretend mother. She was just a woman fighting the darkness for a child she had grown to love. And from the doorway, Caleb watched. He saw the way she soothed Lily's restless tossing. He saw the patience that never wavered, even as her own shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He saw the moonlight catch the glint of tears on her cheeks as she prayed over his daughter. In the long, dark hours of that night, watching this woman fight for his child's life, the stone and ice around Caleb's heart began to crack. He had built his walls so high to keep the world out, to keep the pain out. But he saw now that his fortress was a prison. He had thought he needed no one. And in one terrible night, he understood with blinding clarity that he needed her. As dawn broke, painting the windows with pale streaks of gray and pink, the fever broke with it. Lily's breathing eased into a deep, peaceful sleep. Her skin was cool to the touch. The crisis had passed. Annalise looked up, her body aching with a bone-deep weariness, and met Caleb's eyes across the room. The fear was gone. In its place was something raw and vulnerable. Awe, gratitude, and something else she couldn't name. He beckoned her silently to the kitchen. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she'd kept simmering all night. They stood there in the quiet of the new morning, the steam rising between them like a truce. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they had just been through together. "I can't thank you," he started, his voice thick. "Last night, it was happening all over again. I don't know what I would have done." He trailed off, unable to say the words. "I've been hiding," he said, looking down into his cup. "Hiding from my own life. I thought that was strength. Last night, last night you showed me what real strength is." The honesty in his tired eyes gave her courage. The secret she'd been carrying, the one that had been poisoning her, had to come out. "Caleb," she said softly, "there's something you need to know. Something Lily told me." She told him the words the little girl had whispered in the garden. She said she picked me to be her new mama. She braced herself for him to deny it, to get angry. Instead, his face registered pure, unadulterated shock. He looked like she'd just slapped him. She, she said that," he breathed. He ran a hand through his messy hair, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Annalise, I had no idea. No idea at all." The anguish on his face was real. "You thought, you thought I hired you for that? As some kind of replacement?" He shook his head, his face filled with regret. "I am so sorry. I put an ad in the paper for a cook. That's all. The day I hired you in town, Lily did point you out. She said you had a kind face. That's it. I hired you because your references were good. What she wished for, what she said to you, that was all her own. I knew nothing about it." The relief that washed through Annalise was so immense it almost buckled her knees. The weight she'd been carrying for weeks just vanished. He hadn't been playing a cruel game. He hadn't been deceiving her. He had just been a broken man trying to get through the day. "I see now," Caleb continued, his voice low and intense. His eyes were locked on hers, and for the first time she saw the real man behind the walls. "I see that I hired a cook, but I've been watching the heart of a good and remarkable woman, a woman of kindness and strength and faith." He took a small step closer, the space between them humming with a new energy. "The truth is out now, Annalise. No more secrets. So I'm asking, can we start again? Not as a rancher and his cook, but as Caleb and Annalise, two people, getting to know each other for the first time. Tears filled her eyes, but these were different tears. Tears of relief, of hope. This was the new beginning she had prayed for, the one built on truth, not a child's fantasy. She saw him then, not as a hard, distant man, but as a good man who had been drowning in grief and was finally fighting his way to the surface. She looked at his outstretched hand and then put her own in it. "I would like that very much," she whispered. And a real smile, the first one in weeks, broke across her face like the dawn. Their second beginning was a slow and quiet thing. It unfolded under the vast Wyoming sky, a careful dance of two wounded people learning to trust again. They took long walks after supper, with Lily skipping between them, holding both their hands. They sat on the porch and talked for hours, sharing stories of the lives they'd lived before they'd met. He told her about his first wife, about the sickness that took her, and about the terrible silence she'd left behind. Annalise told him about the crowded city she'd fled, and the hope for a clean slate that had driven her west. They discovered a shared faith, a quiet belief that had carried them both through their darkest days. The lonely silence of the ranch was replaced by conversation, and then, slowly, by laughter. It was Lily's laughter at first, bright and clear, then Annalise's, a little rusty at first, but growing stronger. And finally, one evening, Caleb himself let out a deep, rumbling laugh at a story Annalise told. And the sound was so unexpected and so wonderful that it made her heart skip a beat. Love didn't strike them like lightning. It grew like a sturdy oak, its roots digging deep into the soil of shared hardship and newfound honesty. It was a love built not on fantasy, but on reality. Caleb started leaving bouquets of wildflowers on the kitchen table. Annalise started mending his work shirts without being asked, her stitches small and perfect. He started coming in from the fields a little earlier each day. She started waiting on the porch to watch him ride in. It was a language of small kindnesses, of quiet gestures that said everything that still felt too big to say out loud. Lily watched it all, her blue eyes bright with a wisdom beyond her years. She was the bridge between them, the reason they had come together, and she thrived in the new warmth that filled the house. The emptiness inside her, the hole left by a mother she could barely remember, was being filled by a woman who chose to love her every single day. The house itself seemed to breathe again. Annalise put curtains on the windows and a colorful quilt on the back of a chair. The scent of baking bread was now a constant, a warm and welcome perfume that greeted Caleb at the end of every day. The faded sampler on the wall no longer seemed like a joke. Bless this home. It was becoming a prayer that was being answered, but there was still a shadow Annalise couldn't quite see. A piece of the story she felt was missing. There was a room at the end of the hall upstairs. The door was always closed. Caleb never went in. Lily never went near it. One day Annalise was dusting, and her hand brushed against the doorknob. It was ice cold, even in the warmth of the afternoon. A shiver went down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She felt a presence there, a sadness so profound it was like a stain on the air. She pulled her hand back as if burned. She knew, without knowing how, that whatever Caleb was still hiding from, whatever ghost still truly haunted this ranch, was locked behind that door. And she knew that until that door was opened, their new beginning would never be complete. The question of the locked room sat between them, unspoken but heavy. Annalise could feel it every time she walked down the upstairs hall. A cold spot, a pocket of grief that all the warm bread in the world couldn't touch. She didn't push. She prayed. She waited. She knew Caleb would have to be the one to turn the key. The moment came on a rainy Tuesday in October. The sky was weeping, and the world outside the windows was a blur of gray. Lily was napping. The house was quiet. Caleb came inside, soaked from checking on the cattle, and found Annalise in the kitchen, staring into a cup of tea. He stood there for a long moment, water dripping from his hat onto the floor. "There's something I need to show you," he said, his voice low. He didn't have to say what it was. She just nodded, put down her cup, and followed him up the stairs. He stopped in front of the closed door. His hand hesitated for a moment before he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old iron key. The lock turned with a rusty groan, a sound of protest from a long-held secret. He pushed the door open and stepped back, letting her go in first. The room was a woman's bedroom, but it was like a photograph from another time. Everything was covered in a ghostly layer of dust. The air was thick and stale, the smell of lavender and decay. A four-poster bed stood against one wall, the covers turned down as if waiting for someone who was never coming back. On the dresser, a silverback brush and comb lay next to a small bottle of perfume. It was a shrine, a perfectly preserved moment of loss. "This was Martha's room," Caleb said from the doorway. His voice was hollow. "My wife." Annalise walked slowly into the center of the room, feeling like an intruder. This was the source of the sadness. This was the ghost. After she, after she passed, Caleb struggled with the words. "I couldn't bear to change anything, so I locked the door. I thought if I just locked it away, I could pretend it wasn't there, that the pain wasn't there." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "But it was always there. I was just carrying it around with me instead of leaving it in this room. Every day." He took a deep breath, the sound ragged. You, you have brought life back into this house, Annalise. You've brought life back into me. It's not fair to you or to Lily to keep living with ghosts." He walked over to the window and with a heave, pushed the swollen frame open. Rain-scented air rushed in, stirring the dust motes into a frantic dance. It was the first fresh air that room had seen in years. "Help me," he whispered. "Help me let her go." And so they did. Together they stripped the dusty linens from the bed. They carefully packed Martha's clothes into a trunk. Annalise polished the silver brush set while Caleb took down the heavy drapes. They didn't talk much. They just worked, a silent team dismantling a monument to grief. With every object they packed away, with every surface they wiped clean, the room got a little brighter. The oppressive sadness began to lift. It wasn't about erasing Martha. It was about making peace with her memory. The last thing they found was a small, leather-bound book tucked under the mattress. It was Martha's diary. Caleb held it, his face pale. "I never read it," he said. "I was too afraid." He held it out to Annalise. "Read it, please. Maybe then, maybe then I'll understand." Annalise took the diary, her heart pounding. She had a terrible feeling that the real ghost wasn't Martha herself, but the secret this book held. She sat on the edge of the stripped bed, opened to the first page, and began to read aloud. The first entries were happy, full of love for Caleb, excitement about their new life on the ranch, joy at the news of her pregnancy. Annalise's voice was soft as she read of a young woman full of hope. But as the pages turned, the tone began to shift. The entries grew darker after Lily was born. Martha wrote of a profound sadness she couldn't shake, a feeling of being disconnected from her own baby. She wrote of endless, sleepless nights, of a darkness that was eating her from the inside out. The words were confused, desperate. It wasn't the diary of a happy new mother. It was a cry for help. Caleb sank into a chair, his head in his hands as Annalise continued to read. Martha described feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She loved her daughter, she wrote, but she was terrified of her, terrified she would fail her, terrified she would somehow hurt her. The sickness that had taken her wasn't just in her body, it was in her mind. A deep, consuming depression that no one in 1879 had a name for. They just would have called her hysterical or weak. The final entry was almost illegible, the handwriting a frantic scrawl. "The darkness is winning. I see it in the mirror. I see it when I look at my sweet girl. I cannot let it touch her. This is the only way. Forgive me, my love." Annalise's voice broke on the last words. She closed the book. The room was silent except for the sound of Caleb's ragged sobs. The story he had told himself, the story he had told everyone, was that a sudden fever had taken his wife. But the truth was so much worse. Martha hadn't been taken by a sickness. She had taken her own life, driven to despair by an illness no one understood. The ghost wasn't a memory, it was a lie. The secret was out. It lay between them in the clean, empty room, ugly and sharp. The shame that had kept Caleb silent for years was now visible on his face. "I was a coward," he choked out, his voice muffled by his hands. I found her, out in the barn. I couldn't let people know the truth, the shame of it. I couldn't let it touch Lily. So I lied. I said it was a fever. I lied to everyone. I've been lying to myself for 5 years. He finally looked up at her, his eyes red and raw with unshed tears. How can you even look at me? Annalise didn't answer right away. She went to him, knelt in front of his chair, and gently took his hands away from his face. She held his calloused, trembling hands in her own. I see a man who was broken by a tragedy he didn't understand, she said, her voice full of a compassion that stunned him. I see a man who tried to protect his child in the only way he knew how. I see a man who has carried a terrible burden all alone for far too long. She didn't see a coward. She saw a survivor. The lie hadn't been malicious. It had been born of love and fear. In that moment, the last wall around Caleb's heart didn't just crumble, it was obliterated. He leaned forward and held on to her like a drowning man, and finally allowed himself to grieve for the wife he had truly lost, not the one from the story he'd invented. He grieved for her pain, for her loneliness, for the darkness she had faced alone. They stayed like that for a long time, while the rain washed the world clean outside. When the tears finally subsided, a profound quiet settled over them. It wasn't an empty quiet, it was a peaceful one. The quiet of a wound that has finally been cleaned out, ready to heal. Caleb stood up and walked over to the trunk filled with Martha's things. He closed the lid. Tomorrow I'll take this into town, to the church. They can give it to folks who need it. He turned back to Annalise. Her memory deserves better than to be locked in a dusty room. Her memory should be a blessing to someone. The proposal came a week later. It wasn't grand or poetic. It was simple and real, just like the man himself. They were on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky. Lily was asleep inside. Annalise, he began, turning to face her, I've been living half a life for a long time. You came here, and you made this house a home again. You made me whole again. You showed me what it means to be brave, to face the truth instead of hiding from it. He took her hands in his. I love you, not because I need a cook, or because Lily needs a mother. I love you, for your strength, for your kindness, for your heart. He looked her in the eye, his gaze clear and steady. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me out here in the light? Her yes was a quiet whisper, but it was the surest thing she had ever said in her life. Their wedding was a simple affair at the small church in town. Annalise wore a pale blue dress. Caleb stood tall in his best suit, and Lily stood between them, holding both of their hands, her face beaming. She was no longer a lonely child making a desperate wish. She was a flower that had finally been given enough sun to bloom. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, a real family forged in truth and healed by love. The first year of their marriage was a testament to new beginnings. The ranch thrived under their shared work. The house was filled with laughter and the constant, comforting smell of baking bread. The ghosts were gone, replaced by the joyful sounds of a family building a future. One bright spring morning, as they planned the new season's planting, Annalise placed a hand over her belly and gave Caleb a shy, wondrous smile. Our family is growing, she said softly. God has blessed us. The joy that erupted in Caleb's chest was boundless. He swept her up in his arms, laughing, tears of pure happiness shining in his eyes. When they told Lily she was going to be a big sister, she let out a whoop of delight and immediately started making plans to teach the baby how to talk to horses. The months passed in a happy blur of preparation. Caleb crafted a beautiful cradle, sanding every curve until it was as smooth as silk, a testament of love for the child he couldn't wait to meet. The day the baby came, the house was filled with a new sound, the strong, healthy cry of their son. They named him Benjamin. As Caleb held his son for the first time, looking at his beautiful wife in the bed and his precious daughter peeking around the doorframe, he felt a circle finally close. The grief of the past would always be a part of his story, but it was no longer the whole story. It was just one chapter in a book that was now overflowing with love and hope. That evening, the family gathered on the porch. Annalise rocked Benjamin in her arms. Caleb stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, the other arm around Lily. They watched the sun go down, casting golden shadows across the land they called home. They were no longer a collection of broken pieces. They were a family, whole, healed, and blessed. Their story had started with a misunderstanding, a secret wish whispered in a garden. It had been tested by sickness and haunted by lies. But it had found its way to a forever after, proving that sometimes the most beautiful futures are built on the foundations of a broken past. If you were moved by the story of Caleb and Annalise, a story of how faith and honesty can heal the deepest wounds, then we invite you to become a part of our community. These are the stories we love to tell, tales of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of love to cast out even the darkest shadows. If you believe that every broken heart deserves a second chance and that every house deserves to be a home, don't forget to subscribe. Your support allows us to keep searching for these incredible stories and sharing them with the world. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next journey.